There were record tax rises, 40 billion if you're counting, huge increases in public spending for Britain's creaking public services, and even some pretty punchy political allegations of Tory dishonesty. It was a very big day for the government as Britain's first ever female Chancellor laid out Labour's budget plans to the country. But did Rachel Reeves break promises in her party's manifesto? Were there any surprise rabbits plucked from the Chancellor's hat? And most importantly, how will all these measures affect you? Welcome to this special edition of Talking Politics.
I call the Chancellor of the Exchequer.
The only way to drive economic growth is to invest, invest, invest. The Office for Budget Responsibility have published their own review of the circumstances around the spring budget forecast. They say that the previous government, and I quote, did not provide the OBR with all the information to them. There will be no higher taxes at the petrol pumps next year. I will not increase your national insurance. I will not increase your VAT, and I will not increase your income tax. I am announcing an increase in employers' national insurance contributions. Today, we will increase the lower rate of capital gains tax from 10 to 18%, and the higher rate from 20 to 24%. There will be no extension of the freeze in income tax and national insurance thresholds beyond the decisions by the previous government. We will introduce VAT on private school fees from January 2025.
OK, the Chancellor sits down. Better news for the NHS, but public spending still tight, growth pretty anemic going forward, and a massive load of tax increases, £40 billion a year, the biggest in modern times. I have Anushka, Joel and Robert, who better here to crunch through some of this stuff. Robert is in the lobby of the House of Commons, so let's go back to him. Robert, I have to say, it's getting pretty feisty in there. The Tories clearly annoyed that they've been accused of misleading the OBR, amongst other things. But can you give us a sense of what you feel about the shape of the budget generally?
This is an incredibly ambitious budget. I've turned into the Treasury's Red Book, always published when the Chancellor sits down, to the most important page, which is the one that says policy decisions. And I've never actually in recent years seen anything quite like it. There are 70 different policy decisions costed. Some of them are revenue raising, tax rises, some of them are spending. The headlines are of enormous tax increases and enormous spending and investment increases. So just to give you a flavour, the increase in day-to-day spending by the end of the Parliament, £55 billion a year. Additional government investment by the end of the Parliament, £26 billion a year. So that means that total so-called policy decisions, spending and investment, a staggering £78.5 billion by the time of the next general election, being partly funded by tax increases to the tune of just under, a fraction under £40 billion. So certainly in modern times, absolutely record increases in taxation, and again in modern times, outside of the COVID crisis, outside of the response to the financial crisis of 2007-8, massive increases in public spending, a very, very significant budget.
OK, Robert, thank you very much. Joel, can I come back to your overview?
Yeah. I mean, I think what Rachel Reeves just set out is and she's being accused of betrayal, of making promises that she's broken, is she's saying we had to do something because we discovered this big black hole when we entered office. And she says that the OBR review concludes that there was a deliberate cover-up by Jeremy Hunt and his Treasury team, and that had information been shared about the extent of all these overspends, the March 2024 budget tax cut would never have been made, and Labour, it's changed everything. The facts have changed, and we've got to change our approach. The OBR's take on this is slightly more nuanced. It does say, Tom, the Treasury did not share information back in March about the large pressures on day-to-day public spending, and that there was an unusual extent of commitments against the reserve, which is the big pot of money that to be dipped to in case of emergency. They blew through it in 3 months. Ordinarily you'd expect it to last the year. The point the OBR makes is that no plans were shared about how this overspend could be managed down, but they fall short, Tom, of saying this was a deliberate cover-up, that Jeremy Hunt's team was being deceptive. There's no criticism here of politicians. This seems to be aimed at civil servants. There are 10 recommendations which are made and which they say, which the government has Rachel Reeves has already said she will take on. People can make up their own minds about whether Labour has broken promises or not. A couple of antidotes, because obviously what the Chancellor set out was really sounded very, very generous. I mean, the national insurance hike for employers is absolutely colossal. It will be very interesting to see what the OBR thinks how this will affect the number of people that firms recruit and what happens to pay more broadly. You'd expect that wage growth would grow more slowly, given that it's saddling businesses with all these extra costs. We don't yet know how public sector workers will be treated and if they'll be treated differently. And if the objective, Tom, of all this investment spending that's been set out was to turbocharge economic growth.
It's not happening on these figures.
It really hasn't happened, has it? It's fine. In the short term, there is a boost, but beyond 2027, actually, the forecasts are really pretty depressing, actually. Growth is set to fall from 1.8% annually to 1.5%, then stay at 1.5% the next year. Again, we need to unpack this to see how much of this is government policy.
OK, tax rises, big hit to employers. Maybe not quite as big as we were expecting on capital gains. I mean, changes to inheritance tax, farmers and the like won't like, I'm sure some of them. What did you make in the round of the tax increases?
There were a lot of tax changes targeted at wealth rather than income. So capital gains, you're quite right. There were changes made there. They're quite significant, though. They're lowering borrowing by £8 billion a year in a few years out. Change to the non-dom rules, the OBR thinks will raise £6 billion. The big standout measure, though, is definitely national insurance increases, really chunky, and except £25 billion a year they'll take off borrowing by the end of the forecast, according to the OBR. That's really significant. They are lumping a load of costs onto businesses, and businesses, I think, are still trying to work out and process what that means. How will they change the way they behave? How many people will they recruit? How many people will they retain? And what will happen to pay going forward? It will affect all of these things. These are not harmless tax rises. I mean, I think, Tom, the two objectives that we knew she set out at the beginning of this were to repair and patch up public spending and to revive economic growth and lift everyone's living standards. On the first, on public services, I think the surprise actually is the uplift to day-to-day public spending. It is lower than we were expecting. Again, the briefings that that had been circulated suggested that actually Jeremy Hunt had committed to 1% real terms growth. Rachel Reeves has gone for 1.5% a year going forward. That means, I suspect, that some government departments are going to face some really tough budget settlements in the year ahead. I mean, if you look, actually, they haven't broken it down in a clear way, but there are some government departments next year who, in real terms, will have less than they did last year. Culture, media and sport, environment, food and rural affairs, the Cabinet Office. So objective number one, yes, loads of money being ladled at schools, channelled at the National Health Service. People will like that, but others, arguably still having to tighten belts. And the other thing is in terms of the increase in growth. The OBR concludes that the policies announced today temporarily boost output in the near term. Get this, leave GDP largely unchanged in 5 years' time.
Yeah, if growth was the question, clearly this budget on her own terms is not the answer. Anushka, can I just ask you about some of the tax choices? A lot of speculation that the fuel duty freeze would end and fuel duty would go up. It hasn't. A lot of speculation that she would freeze income tax thresholds. She hasn't. VAT on schools raises more money than I think some people thought it would. What's your, looking at the individual choices she's made and thinking about the politics of it, what do you make of it?
Well, the politics of it on fuel duty is very, very clear, that they are thinking that these are voters that they can't afford to alienate, and that is more important than the arguably, big climate positive results of actually allowing fuel duty to rise. I think someone's leaked this idea that they were going to extend the freeze on personal allowance thresholds. That is absolutely expectation management. I mean, if she had extended it, I think it would have been such a clear breach of the manifesto that it would have been very difficult for her to do that. But, you know, just on national insurance...
Can I just stop you there for a second?
Yeah.
Do you think she thought about it and then backed off, or that was just actual kind of...
They will have thought about everything.
Yeah.
They will have been given the money for everything, and they will
Yeah.
have taken some difficult decisions. And national insurance on employers is a really difficult decision. As Joel was mentioning, that money gets passed on. And in fact, she mentioned in the House of Commons, she said the OBR admits that this will have an impact on people other than employers. And in fact, what they're saying is that by next year, they will assume that firms will pass on 60% of the higher costs to workers and consumers via lower wages and higher prices, leaving 40% on employers. The year after, that rises to 76% on real low wages. And what's happening right now, and it was happening when you just heard Rishi Sunak, is there is a massive battle going on for the narrative. And you've seen this, I've seen this, and how many budgets has the narrative either held or completely unwound? I remember sitting there in 2012, you know, George Osborne had just talked about, you know, allowances for older people. And then I was sitting next to someone from the Daily Mail who was like, granny tax, that's the granny tax. And within days it had unravelled. And the big thing they'll be worrying about now is how much focus is there on things like that? Can she really argue that increasing national insurance on employers isn't going to hit working people? And if not, does that politically come back on her? You know, I thought she started very negatively, if you like, attacking the opposition. It's because they believe very strongly that they have to win the war right now, the briefing war, if you like, on who is to blame for the situation they inherited.
OK, Robert, can I put all of that to you, particularly this is a very, very big tax-raising budget, enormous, certainly by the standards of modern politics. What do you make of that? What do you make of the individual choices? And what do you make of the point Anushka was just making there, that it's crucial now that the government, from its point of view, wins the briefing war?
Well, that obviously is important. I mean, I think there is a case to be made that in the end, they haven't made the tough decisions that many thought they ought to make to rebuild the public services in the way that ought to be made. And indeed, turning down the 1 to 2 billion from putting up the price of food, turning down the multiple billions that would have come from freezing tax allowances is the primary driver for why the real inflation-adjusted increase in public spending across the board is 1.5% rather than the 2% that they were initially planning for. And the reason that matters is that with big increases for health, for example, with a significant increase for defence, there will be other important public services that are going to really struggle to rebuild the quality of the service they provide to all of this. Life is going to remain very tough in the public sector. And despite all of that, however, because nonetheless this is a significant increase in investment spending and public sector spending, the size of the public sector as a whole is growing significantly, but much of that is accounted by what is happening in the health service. So, you know, one might argue that in the end, you know, they will find themselves coming back for more in a year or two if they somehow can't achieve the productivity savings across the piece. And coming back for more in the form of taxes would politically be very damaging for them, which is, as I say, you could argue if they're not going to put up taxes as much as they might have done now, when will they as we get closer to the election? But you can also see the really tight spot that they are in. The OBR has pointed out that this is one of the most significant fiscal loosenings, that means increase in borrowing, of any budget in modern times. That's because they pushed spending as far and borrowing as far as they can go. And what that means is that when the Bank of England meets, they will look at this fiscal loosening and they will see that the OBR itself says this will contribute to a 0.5 percentage point increase in the rate of inflation. And the Bank of England, as I said at the start of this programme, may well on the back of this budget delay interest rate cuts. So for many people, and indeed many businesses, this will look painful. Taxes going up, massive amount, 25 billion on employers' national insurance. One shouldn't underestimate that enormous story, that enormous squeeze on many businesses. But if interest rates also come down slower than expected, this government is going to remain, its popularity has fallen, pretty unpopular for some time to come, and that popularity is not going to be boosted if there are important public services, whether it's local government, whether it is justice, whether it's the police, still saying they haven't got enough money.
Robert, we keep asking about growth being a problem. We can't get growth up, and until we can get growth up, all these questions are incredibly difficult. On the figures that Rachel Reeves has just read out to us, all of this today doesn't really seem to answer our growth problem, does it?
So there was this slightly embarrassing moment in her speech where she said that over the long term, which she didn't define, for most economists the long term is 20 to 30 years, what she's announced today would boost growth. The problem is that people want growth now. They want productivity increases now because they want their living standards to go up now. And you know, a second big embarrassment for her is in black and white in the OBR's official report on her budget, and she says she takes the OBR unbelievably seriously. It says short-term stimulus. And that's another reason why interest rates are going to come down more slowly than otherwise would be the case. But in 5 years' time, when they're going to the country, this budget, it says, will have made no difference to GDP.
OK, Anushka, can I talk about some of the politics with you? You talked just now about the briefing war. I thought it got rather bitter in there, actually. Jeremy Hunt looked absolutely livid, and Rishi Sunak was pretty excised, pretty aggressive at the dispatch box. We've talked often, haven't we, about how much more relaxed he's been as leader of the opposition. He wasn't relaxed today in the slightest. As you say, that's one of the intriguing things about budget days. You never know whether the government's story they're trying to tell actually holds or unravels. You know, you go back to the days of Gordon Brown's 10p tax rate. Do you think their narrative on this is going to hold?
I think it's really difficult for them, and they've already got a situation in which there are newspapers like the Telegraph, like the Times, which aren't going to be very friendly about some of these changes. And so they're up against it in a way more so than a Conservative government was in 2010. I mean, we've discussed this before. I also thought the argument had to be made in 2010 because it was a hung parliament. It wasn't quite so clear that people blamed Labour, whilst I do think people already blame the Conservatives now. An absolute fury from Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt because they absolutely don't accept it. They think that a lot of that stuff was in there and that she is playing politics. I mean, she clearly is, but they are convinced in Downing Street that by stressing this repeatedly, then they might be forgiven for some of the changes they've made. The question is, that will only be the case if they actually change things in people's lives. I mean, Joel was mentioning the lower than expected increase in spending in unprotected government departments. I mean, we had figures last week from the Resolution Foundation that showed even getting to 2% increases only takes spending to a flat level, and they say they're not going to do austerity. Well, 1.5% sounds like it is going to see a return to austerity, certainly in a number of departments.
Do you think, as Robert says, that it's inevitable that they'll have to come back for more? Or do you think they're genuinely hoping they're going to avoid that?
Well, what they are hoping is that by going quite big bang from the start, that they can do what they need to do. And I think Keir Starmer actually said this earlier this week, and then ride it out and then start to see the improvements that you want. And those big improvements are NHS. Waiting lists have to come down. You could hear that in what she said. You have to be able to feel that when you go to A&E, it is a better experience. And, you know, I mentioned potholes when I was going through the measures. They genuinely feel like if they fill in potholes, people will feel like things are different. So it is a gamble. The difficulty they've got is they've had such a decline in popularity so early on, some of which probably could have been avoided, that they're in a really difficult position now to start climbing back up that road.
Joel, this doesn't seem like it's the answer to the growth question. What's she going to do about it?
Well, the measures announced today, according to the government's own forecaster, will increase government consumption, will increase government investment, both of those things, push up growth. Unfortunately, they're going to have a negative impact on private consumption, the amount of money that consumers spend. They'll have a negative impact on net trade and a negative impact on business investment. And obviously, these are the trade-offs that she's managing. You can't lump £24 billion of extra costs onto businesses and not not expect that that will have a consequence. I think this is a sugar rush, isn't it? I mean, in the short term, there is definitely a boost to growth. Robert's making the point that the markets may take a view that actually that slows the rate at which interest rates are cut. At the moment, the betting is still that a cut is nailed on for next week, but that could change. They're going to have to look through this pretty carefully. But that the impact fades, it wipes out, and I think explaining that she's kind of failed to do what she set out to do.
Just a very quick one on the OBR. Obviously, she's all in on we've got to trust the OBR, we've got to believe the OBR. But in reality, in the Treasury, they do feel frustrated that the OBR doesn't rate certain measures as leading to higher growth. Things like planning reforms. The OBR does not accept that that's going to lead to higher growth. They think in government that it will. But it is a big gamble, and they have thrown their weight behind the OBR, obviously.
OK, we've got about 1 minute left. Robert, I'm going to come back to you for a very brief final word.
So, look, I do think that this is a start at rebuilding public services. There were an enormous number of transport investments announced, energy investments, investments in hospitals. It will begin, as she says, to fix some of the broken fabric. But I think there's a very strong argument that she hasn't raised taxes enough and that she's taking a bit of a risk.
That is all we have time for. I'll be back with Anushka and Robert for more Talking Politics in a couple of weeks. I'm off to the US. In the meantime, an awful lot at stake there.